People will say many things when it comes to criticizing movies they don't like. They'll say it was too long, badly written, boring, etc. However, one thing I've noticed many people will say in order to prove that a movie they watched wasn't very good or doesn't deserve too much praise is that it was, quote, too sentimental. And the thing is, I don't know how much that should be considered a legitimate criticism. I mean, just because a movie's high on sentiment, does that really make it bad? Now, before we go too deep into it, I would just like to reiterate that I'm only trying to explore this question objectively in this video, and will only be throwing in my opinions if I believe they'll reinforce a point I'm trying to make. Now, with that being said, I don't think that sentimentality should, in and of itself, be considered a criticism of something. I mean, has anybody ever criticized a movie by simply saying it was too cynical? No. Usually the closest variation you'll get of that is somebody saying that, quote, it's too cynical for a movie like this. And that, I believe, is a very valid type of criticism. As I've gone over at length about, knowing your genres and what a movie is supposed to be are very important. So if somebody thinks that a movie was too cynical or sentimental for the type of movie it should have been, then that's something people can most definitely complain about. But the verification only exists for saying something is too cynical. Because it seems that if somebody says that, they have to clarify that it's too cynical for a movie like this. In other words, I've come to notice that saying something is too cynical isn't considered a real criticism in most circles. However, simply saying that something is too sentimental, or even just that it's quite sentimental, is considered a real criticism without needing to verify your point. And looking at this as objectively as possible, I just don't think it should work like that. To use an excellent example of what I'm talking about here, let's take a look at Steven Spielberg, one of the most famous and critically acclaimed directors to have ever lived. The most common criticism Spielberg has faced throughout his long and storied career is that he can be too sentimental. And again, note that there's no verification that comes with that. And if you don't believe me, there are plenty of sites where you can find only those two simple words used to criticize him. But the thing is, not only would I argue that that alone shouldn't be considered a real criticism, but is he really even too sentimental? I mean, sure, Spielberg is by no means a cynic, but has his sentimental nature ever been to the detriment of any of his movies? Has it ever legitimately taken away from any of them? Because when you really stop and look at it, his sentiment usually improves his stories. Jaws went from a book about characters so unlikable that you'd almost find yourself rooting for the shark to a movie where you care about the characters and want to see the shark finally be killed. All because Spielberg bothered to dedicate some time to giving the characters some humanity. Or in Jurassic Park, which is practically a horror novel, John Hammond is a bad-tempered, self-righteous businessman who cuts corners and blames everybody else for his problems, which gets him eaten by one of his own creations in the end. But by instead choosing to embrace the kid in us all, Spielberg manages to make a movie that perfectly mixes the realistic horror with the wonder and awe of what man and nature really can do, and lets the characters and audience truly marvel at these long extinct creatures as well as the thought of them returning in modern times. And because of that, John Hammond becomes an ultimately well meaning man who sees his creations as much more than just a means to a profit, because he can truly appreciate what he's actually been able to do. and it's kept a lot more ambiguous as to who's to blame for Dennis's betrayal, making it seem like it's much more about his own greed. And because of that, Hammond is allowed to survive the story while at the same time being forced to admit that maybe his idealism was a bit too high for everyone's good. Basically, Spielberg makes the smart decision in this case to embrace his signature sentimentality, but through the character of John Hammond and the dinosaur's violent nature, is also able to show the harsh realities of life, which was honestly a brilliant way to handle such an idea by mixing the wonder and terror instead of leaning so far into the horror like Michael Crichton did. And there are other examples of that in his movies as well, such as his sentiment allowing the horrors and devastation of Schindler's List, as well as his ultimate triumph in saving over 1,000 people, be all the more effective, or using it very similarly in Saving Private Ryan so he can truly show the consequences of war and what it does to people. Now, what I'm getting at here is Spielberg isn't an idiot. He can accept the harsh truths of life and is not afraid to show them on screen. And that he knows how to use his sentimental style of filmmaking to actually enhance these realities when he so chooses and make them feel even worse. But at the same time, he also isn't afraid to make movies where he's basically telling the audience that the world can be a good place and that there's plenty of good to be had in it. And I just don't see anything inherently wrong with that. It's no more wrong than saying the world is a horrible place with very little good to be had in it. But there are also movies he's done like Hook, in which he really cranks out the sentiment. But again, I just don't think it should be a real criticism to simply say it's too sentimental. Because it's clearly a feel-good movie meant for children, so it honestly should be a bit sentimental. I mean, does the sentiment really drag down the movie? Does it make it not as good as it could have been? And to use another Robin Williams movie as an example, it's not like Patch Adams where they're using the sentiment to emotionally manipulate the audience. Spielberg's not trying to manipulate you with Hook, he just wants you to feel good. And again, speaking as neutrally as I can, is that really a problem? Or something that should be criticized in and of itself? Now, considering how well Spielberg's movies have done and how popular he is even to this day, it's obvious that not everybody feels that his sentimental style is a problem. In fact, from a general audience standpoint, it could almost be viewed as a welcome relief, getting to see a great filmmaker who actually wants to enjoy the good things in life instead of always reminding the audience of how bad it can be. But to stay on topic, my point was simply about using the he's too sentimental thing as a legitimate argument. Because while he may be high on sentiment, as I've just went over, it generally doesn't take away from his movies and can sometimes even enhance them. So if somebody's still going to try and make that argument, it's honestly more about personal preference than an argument over quality at that point. And let's be real here, people do let these two mix way too often. And that's the main reason I think the too sentimental argument shouldn't be used as a real criticism, because it more often has to do with preference than with legitimate quality. However, that isn't to say that sentimentality can't be overdone to the point that it starts to affect the story. Because I actually did see a movie once where exactly that happened. And that was a completely forgotten 1944 movie called It Happened Tomorrow. Now, just a quick disclaimer, there will be some spoilers ahead, so either skip over this part or turn off the video if you'd rather see it for yourself first. Alright, so for those of you who are still here, It Happened Tomorrow is about a newspaper man who starts getting his hands on papers with the next day's news, allowing him to effectively see the future. Now, with a premise like that, one might expect a whole movie of him running around, taking full advantage of the fact that he now knows what will happen the next day and all the misadventures he gets into, or even possibly explore where the papers are coming from. However, the movie doesn't really do that. I mean, the newspapers most certainly do have a huge impact on the plot, but the movie's main focus is actually on him falling in love with a fortune teller, and their romance is what takes up the bulk of the story. And while definitely not a bad movie, I just feel that it could have been better and a lot more remarkable if they hadn't played the romantic angle so heavily and focused a lot more on the science fiction and fantasy aspects of it. Because let's face it, a romance can be the focus of any movie. But how often do you get to see a movie where somebody's able to read news before it happens? So, what I'm basically getting at here is I believe that this was a movie that you could almost say was too sentimental and have it be a legitimate criticism. But even then, I feel it would need elaboration, such as saying it put the sentiment over the fantasy, or this movie shouldn't have been so sentimental, it got in the way of the more interesting ideas. Because I still say that simply saying it was too sentimental just wouldn't cut it. Yes, it arguably is too sentimental, but only because it actually affects the overall quality, which I feel is something that should be made clear. In other words, I shouldn't be able to just say that it's too sentimental and have people take my words at face value. They should be expecting me to explain what I mean by that before they'll take my criticisms seriously. Okay, so to put it all simply, I think that the common criticism of movies being too sentimental shouldn't be considered a valid criticism in and of itself. Because more often than not, the sentiment doesn't even affect the overall quality. So when most people say that, it's actually coming from a place of personal taste rather than trying to review a movie objectively. And when it does actually affect the quality, I feel that should require elaboration. Just like how saying that something is too cynical is not actually considered a criticism and must be explained before people will take it seriously as a criticism. Because, as I said before, I don't see anything inherently wrong with a movie being sentimental as long as it fits the story and doesn't negatively impact it. And as a result of that, especially with the arguments I just made, I just don't see how somebody saying that a movie is too, or even just very, sentimental can be enough to explain why it wasn't good. There's nothing wrong with sentiment. And with how cynical and jaded our society has become, maybe we could even use a few more movies that aren't afraid to crank up the sentiment and make the audience just feel good. Okay, that's all I have to say on that. So now it's your turn to tell me. Do you think that people are too hard on movies that are very sentimental? Or do you believe that saying something's too sentimental is a perfectly valid criticism and should stay that way? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And just like always, you are free to disagree with my assessment. I was trying to be as impartial as possible, but if you think I came to the wrong conclusion, you are most definitely free to say it. Thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.